In the heart of West Africa, a young soldier defied the world. Ibrahim Traoré, a name now whispered across villages and shouted in crowded streets, is rebuilding a nation once left in ruins. From airports rising out of the dust, to roads cutting through forgotten lands, to universities where hope is reborn. This is the story of Burkina Faso's rebirth. But behind the triumph lies betrayal, sabotage, and global powers who swore he would fail. Even Donald Trump could not ignore what unfolded, and his shocking reaction stunned the world. Stay with us until the very end, because what you are about to witness is not just the story of one man. It is the beginning of Africa's new chapter. Before we dive deep, don't forget to like this video, share it with those who still believe in the power of hope, and subscribe for more cinematic stories that the world needs to hear. The airstrip lay silent. Rusting machinery sat abandoned in the red dust, its metal bones creaking under the relentless Sahel sun. Once, it had been the site of promise. An unfinished airport meant to connect Burkina Faso to the skies, a gateway to a modern era. But years of corruption, foreign interference, and stolen funds had turned it into a graveyard of broken steel and broken dreams. Weeds grew where airplanes should have landed. Birds nested in hollow concrete shells that were supposed to be terminals. A sign, half collapsed, bore the faded words, Burkina Faso International. It was a monument not to progress, but to betrayal. And somewhere across the ocean, the mockery was loud. On an American stage, before a crowd roaring with laughter and applause, Donald J. Trump's voice cut through the air. Folks, look at Africa. Look at Burkina Faso. Total disaster. They can't even build an airport that works. Airports, roads, universities. Believe me, it'll never happen. Not in a million years. Sad. The clip would be played again and again on Burkinabe televisions. A wound pressed deeper each time. People in dusty villages watched on old flickering screens as the world's most powerful man dismissed them as hopeless. Mothers fetching water, students studying under trees, farmers walking barefoot miles on broken roads. They heard it, and their silence burned. But one man did not remain silent. Ibrahim Traoré, the young soldier-turned-leader, listened in. The shadows of Ouagadougou. His jaw clenched. His eyes narrowed. Not because Trump was his enemy, but because the words carried truth twisted into insult. His nation was broken. His people were suffering. And the world expected nothing from them but failure. The weight of history pressed on him. The ghost of Thomas Sankara lingered like a shadow in the corridors of power. A reminder of a time when Burkina Faso had dared to dream of self-reliance. Sankara had built roads, schools, and hospitals before betrayal cut his life short. And now, decades later, Burkina Faso stood once more on the edge of despair, mocked by the same powers Sankara had defied. The people were hungry. Roads crumbled into dust. Universities overflowed with students who had no classrooms, no books, no future. And still, foreign contractors siphoned gold, cotton, and uranium, leaving only scars in the earth. The International Monetary Fund, with its polished suits and hidden contracts, demanded repayment while children starved. The humiliation was complete. Burkina Faso had been reduced to statistics in glossy reports: GDP decline, infrastructure deficit, failed state index. But Traoré saw something the world did not. He saw possibility hidden inside ruins. When he first walked through the skeletal remains of that abandoned airport, he placed his hand on the cold concrete. In his mind, he did not see failure. He saw runways lit at night, planes descending from the skies, children waving at the first aircraft they had ever seen. He saw students boarding buses on paved highways, bound for universities built in glass and steel. The vision was clear, but the road to it was paved with shadows. Unknown to him, three forces were already moving against his dream. The entrenched, elites, ministers who had grown fat off corruption, who feared transparency more than war. The foreign interests, corporations, and Western financiers who saw Burkina Faso only as a mine to be drained. The cynics, ordinary citizens and soldiers who no longer believed in change, who whispered, "It cannot be done." And across the ocean, Trump's words echoed like prophecy. Airports, roads, universities, they'll never make it. Total disaster. But what Trump did not know was this: Traoré would take those words and forge them into fire. Burkina Faso was a nation stitched together by pain. Villages dotted the dry land, their homes built of mud and straw, standing against winds that carried dust from the Sahara. In the capital, Ouagadougou, traffic fought through potholes large enough to swallow cars. Bridges sagged under the weight of neglect, and in the rainy season, whole communities were cut off by floods. Students gathered in overcrowded classrooms, some standing for lack of desks. Others studied under mango trees, their notebooks balanced, on their knees. Teachers went months without pay, yet still arrived each morning, carrying chalk like a weapon against ignorance. Hospitals overflowed, their corridors lined with patients gasping for breath, children fighting fevers, mothers praying for medicine that never came. Ambulances broke down on dirt tracks long before reaching villages, and above it all, the cruel arithmetic of debt. Each month, the International Monetary Fund demanded repayment. Each year, billions in resources left Burkina Faso's soil, enriching banks and corporations abroad. And in return, the nation was offered loans chained with conditions that forbade it from building the very infrastructure it needed. This was the landscape Traoré inherited, a nation with more potential than almost any other, but shackled at every turn. And then came the whispers. A confidential dossier arrived at Traoré's desk. It contained contracts signed years before his rise, deals that sold Burkina Faso's future for pennies, roads promised but never built, airports half-funded, then abandoned, universities reduced to empty blueprints. The signatures of his predecessors were there, along with stamps from multinational firms and foreign banks. And at the bottom of the file, one sentence stood out: project halted, funds reallocated. The billions that could have transformed. Burkina Faso had vanished into foreign accounts. It was betrayal, written in ink. Traoré knew the risks of confronting this system. He had risen to power in a storm, but storms breed enemies. The old elite whispered of his inexperience. Foreign envoys warned him not to defy international obligations. Even some of his generals muttered that airports and universities were luxuries in a nation where people starved. But Traoré believed the opposite. He believed that airports were not luxuries but lifelines, that roads were not luxuries but arteries of survival, that universities were not luxuries but the very engines of liberation. And so he made his decision. He would rebuild the airport. He would carve new highways through the Sahel. He would raise universities from the dust, and he would do it with or without the world's approval. But the moment he announced his plans, the resistance began. Foreign investors scoffed, calling his projects reckless. Leaked memos from Western embassies described him as a dangerous populist with unrealistic ambitions. Local elites, who had grown rich off stalled projects, quietly funneled money to opposition groups. And in the United States, Trump returned to the subject during one of his campaign rallies. They're saying this guy in Burkina Faso is going to build airports, roads, universities. Folks, come on. These are villages with no electricity. They've got nothing. He can't do it. It's fake. Believe me, I know deals. This is a bad deal. The laughter of his crowd echoed through television screens in Africa, like salt in an open wound. But in Ouagadougou, Traoré did not flinch. Instead, he stared at the glowing screen in silence. He knew the world doubted him. He knew even his allies doubted him. And in that moment, he made a vow. He would not only prove Trump wrong, he would prove the entire world wrong. The abandoned airstrip would rise again. The roads would cut through the wilderness. The universities would open their gates to a generation that refused to bow. Burkina Faso would be reborn, and the world would have no choice but to watch. The first stones were laid under the burning Sahel sun. Men with shovels, women carrying water, young engineers sketching lines across barren ground. The dream began in silence, but it spread quickly, like sparks across dry grass. The people of Burkina Faso, long denied progress, felt something stirring. Where once there had been only rusting frames and collapsed bridges, there were now blueprints pinned to walls and trucks rumbling across the dust. In the capital, a new billboard rose, Burkina Faso Reborn. It showed a plane lifting off into the sky, a ribbon of road stretching into the horizon, and a university crowned with towers of glass. Many passed it with skepticism, others with quiet hope. But some looked at it with fear, for they knew what this dream threatened. For decades, the nation had been a feeding ground for vultures. Corporations dug into its earth, stripped its gold, and left only scars. Politicians signed contracts in secret chambers, pocketing fortunes while their people starved. For them, an airport meant more than just planes. It meant independence. Roads meant more than asphalt. They meant unity. Universities meant more than classrooms. They meant a generation that could no longer be deceived. And so, the knives began to sharpen. One night, a convoy of cement trucks bound for the airport site caught fire under mysterious circumstances. The flames devoured the vehicles, leaving only twisted steel and blackened earth. Officials called it an accident, but Traoré knew better. It was sabotage, designed to send a message: stop before it's too late. The next morning, his ministers arrived with excuses. The budget was too small, the soil too unstable, the rains too unpredictable. They suggested scaling back, postponing, negotiating again with the IMF for support. But Traoré listened in silence, his face carved in stone. When they finished, he dismissed them with a single phrase: "We are not building for today. We are building for a century." But the IMF had other plans. Letters arrived from foreign banks demanding repayment of debts. Interest rates climbed like noose-tightening ropes. Sanctions were whispered. Trade slowed. Even basic imports, fuel, machinery, medicine, became harder to acquire. It was pressure, carefully applied, meant to squeeze the breath out of the project before it could take flight. And still, Traoré built. His soldiers laid foundations. His engineers worked by torchlight when electricity failed. Villagers arrived with baskets of food, feeding workers at the sites. Old men carried bricks, children fetched water, women sang as they labored side by side. What had begun as a state project became a movement, but the shadows did not rest. Inside the government, traitors leaked blueprints to foreign contractors. Bridges mysteriously collapsed days before opening. Machinery broke down without cause. Workers vanished on night roads, their bodies later found by riversides. Fear spread, whispered rumors that there was a hand inside the palace itself, guiding the sabotage. And then, once again, Trump's voice returned. On television screens in Burkina Faso, his rally rants blared across grainy signals. "They're trying to build airports and roads. Total waste of money, folks. They don't even have food. I told you before, it can't be done. It's fake news. Believe me, I know construction better than anyone. This project? A disaster. Everybody's laughing." The words stung like whips. Some began to doubt again. Soldiers asked themselves whether their leader was dragging them into ruin. Ministers whispered of rebellion. Farmers wondered whether their labor would feed their families or only dreams. But Traoré remained unshaken. At night, he stood alone at the construction sites, staring at the skeletal beams rising against the dark. He thought of Sankara, who had planted millions of trees, who had declared self-reliance even as the world turned against him. And he whispered into the silence, "This time We will not be betrayed. Yet betrayal was already moving in the shadows. A secret report landed on his desk, its ink still fresh. It revealed something more dangerous than sabotage or IMF threats. One of his own generals, a man he had trusted, had been meeting foreign envoys in the dead of night. Their plan was clear: stall the projects, sow division, then topple him before. The dream took root. The conspiracy deepened. Intelligence suggested funding was being funneled into armed groups across the border, rebels trained and armed not to win, but to destabilize. Roads under construction were ambushed. Supply lines were cut. Whole villages fled before bands of raiders. Burkina Faso was bleeding even as it tried to rise, and yet hope was not extinguished. The first road connected two villages that had never before shared trade. For the first time, a farmer carried his goods to market in a truck instead of on his back. Children rode bicycles on asphalt instead of mud. A mother wept as her sick child reached a hospital in hours instead of days. The first foundations of the university were laid, and students gathered at the site, touching the cement as if it were sacred ground. They believed they were touching their future. At the airport, the skeleton of a terminal rose like a beast reborn. It was not yet complete, but it was enough to silence the laughter of those who said it would never exist. And then something unexpected happened. Trump, perhaps sensing the shift, changed his tone. At a rally, when questioned by reporters about Burkina Faso's progress, he smirked and said, "Well, we'll see. They say they're building an airport, roads, universities. A lot of people don't think it's real. Maybe it's happening, maybe it's not. But if it happens, hey, good for them. I'll be the first to admit, it's something. It was not praise. It was not respect. But it was something new, a crack in the wall of mockery. And in Burkina Faso, people noticed. They replayed the clip. They shared it. Even Trump is watching us now. But for Traoré, there was no time for celebration. Because in the silence of his office, the intelligence files grew darker. The conspiracy was closer than ever. The rising storm was no longer just foreign banks or foreign companies or Trump's laughter. It was betrayal inside his own circle, and if he did not confront it soon, the dream of airports, roads, and universities would collapse before his people ever touched it. The storm broke, not in the skies, but in the silence of the palace. Traoré sat in the dim glow of his office lamp, the weight of reports piling before him like bricks of sorrow, bridges collapsing before inauguration, supplies vanishing from warehouses, entire convoys hijacked in the wilderness, their drivers never seen again. And there, stamped with a general's seal, was the evidence: shipments diverted, blueprints leaked, funds rerouted through hidden accounts. Betrayal had a face, and it was the face of one he had once trusted. A general who had sworn loyalty now dined in secret with foreign envoys, his pockets lined with the blood of his own people. The young leader felt the weight of Sankara's ghost, more heavily than ever. History whispered, this is how it begins, betrayal within, foreign hands pulling strings. A dream cut short before it takes flight. But Traoré was not Sankara, and he would not fall the same way. The conspirators moved quickly. Rumors spread like fire across markets and villages. The airport is a scam. The roads will never be finished. The universities are just empty shells. They whispered that Traoré had stolen the funds himself, that he was no better than the leaders before him. Fear took root. Soldiers muttered in barracks. Farmers hesitated to volunteer for road work. Students, once hopeful, questioned whether they had been deceived. And then the sabotage struck harder. A newly constructed highway cracked overnight, entire sections collapsing as if swallowed by the earth. Investigations revealed the truth. The concrete had been mixed with sand instead of cement, the result of deliberate tampering. At the airport site, fire consumed scaffolding and supplies. Workers fled in terror, believing curses haunted the land. And in the capital, graffiti appeared on walls. The dream is dead. Traoré walked among the ruins with his people, his boots sinking into the ash of what had once been scaffolds. His soldiers stood tense around him, but he waved them away. He wanted to hear the voices directly. An old man approached, his voice trembling. "General, we believed you. But maybe they were right. Maybe this is not for us." Traoré did not answer. He simply placed his hand on the man's shoulder, then turned back to the skeleton of the airport terminal. His silence was heavier than words. Across the ocean, Trump's voice returned, now louder, sharper, more cutting. "I told you, folks. I told you it would fail. Airports falling apart, roads collapsing. It's a total disaster. They wasted their money. They wasted their time. I've built real towers, real airports. I know construction. This is fake. Everybody's laughing at Burkina Faso." The words cut deeper than sabotage. On African television, the clip played again and again, fueling doubt. Trump's ridicule became fuel for the conspirators, proof for the cynics. But something else stirred in the shadows. The people were watching more closely than before. His words hurt, but they also illuminated the scale of what Traoré was attempting. If even Trump cared, then perhaps this was bigger than they thought. The IMF struck next. Loans were frozen, aid packages suspended, imports delayed at ports, left rotting on docks. Medical supplies ran short. Fuel prices doubled. Hunger deepened. The message was clear: stop the projects, or watch the nation collapse. Some ministers broke under the pressure. They begged Traoré to abandon the dream, to negotiate, to surrender. But he refused, and that refusal only deepened the betrayal. Late one night, whispers of a coup surfaced. The conspiring general was moving troops quietly, rallying officers with promises of foreign backing. His plan was simple: strike before the airport inauguration, seize the palace, and announce a return to order. Traoré received the intelligence at dawn. His face hardened. He knew what it meant. The battle was no longer about airports, roads, or universities. It was about survival. Meanwhile, the suffering of the people grew unbearable. A mother buried her child who died waiting for medicine that never came. Farmers abandoned fields, scorched by drought. Soldiers, unpaid and exhausted, questioned why they were building roads while their families starved. Despair crept like fog through the villages. Hope was dimming. And yet, in the midst of the darkness, small lights flickered. A group of students gathered at the half-built university, carrying candles. They sat among the unfinished walls, reading by dim light, declaring it their classroom of tomorrow. Villages rebuilt sections of road destroyed by saboteurs, working with bare hands when machines failed. Mothers carried food to soldiers guarding the airport site, whispering, "Hold the line, for our children." The dream had not died. It was wounded, bleeding, but alive. Traoré stood at the center of it all, torn between despair and determination. He had never faced enemies so close, never carried such weight. At night, he heard the voice of Sankara in his mind. "Courage is not the absence of fear, Ibrahim. It is the decision to stand when all others kneel." And so he prepared. The conspirators were tightening their grip. The IMF was strangling the economy. Trump's voice was growing louder, his ridicule spreading across the world. The people were divided between faith and despair. All threads were pulling toward a single night. The night the airport was to be inaugurated. The night the conspirators planned their strike. The night Burkina Faso's fate would be decided. The night of the airport inauguration arrived like a storm wrapped in silence. Burkina Faso's skies were choked with dust, as though the Sahara itself had risen to witness history. The new terminal stood tall in the distance, half shrouded in scaffolding, half glorious, its lights piercing the darkness like beacons of defiance. For the people, it was not just an airport, it was a doorway to dignity. For the conspirators, it was a threat that had to be destroyed. In the hours before dawn, whispers traveled through the capital. Soldiers moved in shadows. Trucks rolled quietly through side streets. Somewhere in the north, fires burned on the highways, cutting off supply convoys. The coup had begun. Traoré was already awake, dressed in his military fatigues, his red beret low on his forehead. He stood in the palace courtyard, watching his most loyal soldiers line up, their faces tight with fear and determination. He knew what was coming, and he knew he could not run. At the airport site, thousands had gathered, wrapped in tattered flags, singing songs of Sankara and shouting Traoré's name. Mothers carried children on their backs, farmers clutched tools, students raised notebooks like banners. They had come not just for an inauguration, but for a declaration that Burkina Faso would not be erased. But the conspirators were already moving. Explosions ripped through the far end of the runway. Flames clawed at the scaffolding. Panic swept. The crowd, soldiers loyal to the traitorous general, stormed in, guns raised, firing into the air. People screamed and scattered. Dust, smoke, and fire swallowed the airfield. And then, from the heart of the chaos, Traoré appeared. He marched through the fire with a small band of loyal guards, the red beret unmistakable, the figure unshaken. Bullets cracked overhead, but he did not flinch. He climbed onto a half-built platform, microphone in hand, his voice carried by sheer force of will above the chaos. They want you to run. They want you to believe the dream is dead. But look. He pointed to the burning runway, to the half-built terminal rising behind the smoke. Even in flames it stands. Even in fire it rises. If you leave tonight, we lose everything. If you stand, they cannot break us. The crowd, trembling moments before, erupted. Farmers dropped their tools and formed barricades. Students linked arms in defiance. Mothers pulled their children close, but refused to flee. The conspirators' soldiers, expecting a stampede, now faced a wall of unbroken will. In Washington, Trump's words echoed across television screens. He was live on air, his expression sharp, his hands cutting the air. It's chaos. Total chaos. I told you it was coming. They built this airport, this joke of a project, and now look, fire. Fighting complete disaster. The generals are taking over, folks. It's going to be another failed country. Sad. Very sad. The world listened. His words spread instantly across media outlets, amplifying the image of collapse. Markets reacted, investors withdrew, analysts declared Burkina Faso finished. But then something happened. Trump's tone shifted mid-broadcast. As he watched live footage of the crowd refusing to scatter, of Traoré standing defiantly in the flames, something changed in his eyes. You know, he muttered, almost reluctantly, I've got to say, this guy, he's not running. They're not running. Nobody expected that. Nobody thought these people would stay. It's unbelievable. Maybe. Maybe he's tougher than they thought. And with that, the world tilted. What had begun as ridicule became recognition. The clip spread across Africa faster than fire. Trump himself, the loudest critic, admitting shock at Traoré's courage. To millions, it was confirmation. If even Trump saw it, then the dream was real. Back at the airport, the battle reached its peak. The traitorous general arrived, flanked by armored trucks and foreign mercenaries. His voice thundered through megaphones. Stand down! This is over! Traoré has failed you! Go home and live, or die here with him. But no one moved. Instead, the crowd roared back, drowning him out. Their chants rose like thunder. Traoré! 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 The general's face twisted with rage. He gave the order to advance. Shots rang out. Barricades splintered. Smoke thickened. And then Traoré descended from the platform, walking straight toward the advancing soldiers. His guards tried to hold him back, but he pushed forward, his voice a whip of fire. You betray your country for silver. You betray your brothers for chains. Look into their eyes. He pointed at the people standing unarmed, refusing to move. You'll have to kill them all to kill this dream. The soldiers faltered. Their hands shook. Some lowered their rifles. Others turned their aim away. The general screamed at them, spitting fury, but his voice was lost in the roar of the people. And then, the tide broke. One by one, the soldiers turned their guns on the general. The mercenaries, realizing their backing had collapsed, fled into the smoke. The conspirator stood alone, his power shattered. His scream of rage was swallowed by the chants that now thundered across the airfield. Burkina Faso Reborn! The flames were doused. The smoke lifted, and as dawn broke, the first rays of light fell upon the terminal, scarred, but standing. The airport had survived, the people had endured, and Traoré had won. Not with tanks, not with bloodshed, but with unshakable defiance and the courage to stand when all others would have fled. That morning, across the world, headlines shifted. What had been declared a failure now became a miracle. In Washington, Trump returned to the cameras, now struggling to own the moment. Look, I was tough on him, very tough, but maybe that's what made him fight harder. People are saying, and I don't know, but they're saying, this is one of the greatest comebacks they've ever seen. Airports, roads, schools. Maybe he's doing it. Maybe he's actually doing it. And you know what? People are watching. The world is watching. Even me. The clip went viral. For Africans watching in Dakar, Lagos, Nairobi, and Kinshasa, it was not Trump's approval they cared for. It was the proof that even the most powerful voice in the West could not deny what had happened. The impossible had been made visible. That night, as the fires cooled and the airfield settled into silence, Traoré walked alone to the edge of the runway. The skeleton of the terminal stood before him, broken but unbowed. He placed his hand on the steel frame and whispered, "This is only the beginning." The wind carried his words across the dust, across the crowd still gathered, across a nation that had been tested in fire and had not broken. The climax had ended, but the story of rebirth had only just begun. The dawn after the flames felt unreal. In Ouagadougou, the city awoke to the sound of drums, bells, and voices rising as one. Word had spread through the night like wildfire. The coup had failed, the airport stood, and Traoré had not fallen. Crowds poured into the streets, not in panic but in triumph. Farmers carried hoes like banners. Mothers lifted children onto their shoulders. Students draped themselves in flags, their notebooks held high like sacred texts. Everywhere the chant rose again and again. Burkina Faso Reborn! The conspirators were finished. Soldiers who had betrayed their oath now faced trial before their people. The traitorous general was dragged from his hiding place, his power dissolved, his arrogance shattered. He had plotted with foreigners, schemed for gold, but in the end, he stood alone, abandoned by those he had tried to command. For the first time in decades, justice did not come from outside. It came from within. The IMF's fury was swift, but hollow. Sanctions had failed. Economic strangulation had not broken the people. It had hardened them. The projects they tried to smother had become stronger in resistance. Analysts in Europe shook their heads. Officials in Washington scrambled to explain. But none of their words could hide the truth. A small, landlocked nation had defied them, and in defying, had exposed their power as brittle. And then came the clip, the one that would echo across continents. Trump, live on air, replayed the footage of Traoré standing before the flames. His voice, once mocking, now carried a different tone. I've seen leaders run. I've seen countries fall apart. But this guy, he stood. He didn't run. He didn't hide. People were chanting his name, even when everything was burning. I'll tell you folks, it's something. Maybe one of the strongest things I've seen. The words hit harder than any sanction. For African youth, hearing Trump, the man who once ridiculed their continent, acknowledge Traoré's strength, was like a spark to dry grass. It ignited a fire of belief. If even Trump could not deny the miracle, then the miracle was real. Across Africa, screens flickered with hope. In Ghana, students painted murals of Traoré beside Thomas Sankara, the faces of two eras looking in the same direction. In Nigeria, workers marched with placards that read, "If Burkina Faso can rise, so can we." In South Africa, young activists replayed the footage of the flames and chanted the same words, "Stand and fight." It was not just Burkina Faso that had been reborn. It was a continent rediscovering its breath. Inside the half-built university, the first classes began under open skies. Students sat on unfinished floors, using bricks as chairs, scribbling notes with borrowed pens. They called it the University of the Future, not because it was finished, but because they were. On the roads scarred by sabotage, villagers gathered to repair them with their bare hands. They carried stones, mixed cement, and laid each, block with pride, whispering, "For our children." At the airport, workers returned, not in fear, but in triumph. The half-burned scaffolding was rebuilt. The terminal rose again, scarred yet stronger, like the nation itself. Traoré stood before them once more, this time not in fire, but in morning light. His voice was heavy with exhaustion, yet unbroken. They tried to bury us. They tried to chain us. But we have shown the world, Burkina Faso will not die. This airport is not just stone and steel. It is our courage made visible. These roads are not just paths. They are the bridges to our future. These universities are not just classrooms. They are the minds that will carry us forward. The crowd roared. And then he asked the question, not just to Burkina Faso, but to all who listened across Africa. Is this the moment we break the chains? Is this the day Africa stands as one? Silence followed for a heartbeat, heavy, electric. Then from thousands of throats, the answer thundered back. Yes! In the months that followed, the projects accelerated. The airport neared completion. Roads carved their way across forgotten villages. The first lecture hall was finished, its walls painted with the words, "Knowledge is freedom." The IMF could no longer deny the progress. Foreign powers who once sneered now sent envoys, hoping to negotiate, to regain the influence they had lost. But Traoré did not kneel. He walked the path Sankara had once dreamed, but with a nation stronger behind him. And far beyond, in Washington, Trump could not resist returning to the story. People are saying it's a miracle. They're saying this guy, Traoré, is changing Africa. I don't know. But maybe they're right. Nobody thought it could be done. Nobody. And now the world is watching Africa differently. It's very interesting. Very interesting. The clip spread again. But this time it was not ridicule nor surprise. It was acknowledgement. For Burkina Faso, it was proof. They had not only rebuilt their nation, they had shaken the world. As the sun set over Ouagadougou, the new runway glistened in the twilight, a silver scar across the land. Children played, near its edges, their laughter carrying in the wind. Mothers watched them with quiet pride. And in the palace, Traoré stood alone for a moment, gazing at the horizon. He knew the battles were not over. He knew the world would test them again, but he also knew something deeper. The nation had stood in fire and had not broken. The people had chosen hope when despair was easier. The world had tried to silence them, and instead, they had made the world. Listen, Burkina Faso had been reborn, and Africa had taken its first breath of tomorrow.